listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt. Thank you, Your Honor.
And that's Joseph James DeAngelo, or as we now know him to be, the Golden State Killer. Welcome to Law & Crime Now, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber. DeAngelo uttered that apology before his official sentencing by Judge Michael Bowman. The 74-year-old man has been pled guilty to 13 murders and admitted to dozens of rapes and burglaries spanning the 1970s and 80s, and it was all part of a plea deal to take the death penalty off the table. So now the question becomes, what is the rest of his life going to look like? What is his fate? Take a look.
The aggregate sentence for Joseph James DeAngelo is the following. Counts 2 and 14 through 13, he's committed to the state prison for the indeterminate term of 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentence to run consecutive to the indeterminate life term for count 26. The weapons enhancements in counts 4, 5, 7, and 26 consist of an aggregate determinate term of 8 years to run consecutive. Another way to state the sentences as follows. Mr. DeAngelo is sentenced to a total of 11 life without the possibility of parole sentences, plus an additional life sentence, plus an additional 8 years. This is the absolute maximum sentence the court is able to impose under the law. And while the court has no power to make a determination of where the defendant is imprisoned, the survivors have spoken clearly. The defendant deserves no mercy.
In other words, DeAngelo is never going to set foot out of prison for the rest of his life. Joining me now is Law & Crime legal analyst Mike Koribanics, as well as juvenile judge and trial attorney Judge Ashley Willcott. I want to thank you both for coming on. Mike, let me just start with you. Actually, Judge, let me start with you first, because what did you make of his statement? We had been talking about it as we were covering this. Would DeAngelo say anything? He said something short, but not that sweet. What do you think?
It sounded hollow. I just didn't feel like there was any emotion in what he had to say. And so, sure, he said, I listened to everything, and I'm sorry to everyone I hurt. Really? That's it? So I just didn't find it very believable or credible. I'm a little surprised he chose to say anything at all.
Who knows what's going on in the mind of DeAngelo? It's not a place that a lot of people want to be. Mike, let me turn to you. We're at the conclusion of something that began in 1975, a case that went cold for so long. 2018, he was arrested, and now finally, after all of these victim impact statements, he has been sent away. He was wheeled out. And I'm curious, what do you think about the closure of this case? Because I'm struck by something that one of the prosecutors said after the sentencing. She said, I don't believe we will ever know the magnitude of what Mr. DeAngelo did. So is this closure or not?
That's a good question. I mean, Jesse, this kind of case has people thinking like, what really is justice? I mean, what could you do to this person who has caused so much pain and suffering, not only to his victims, but the collateral damage? And I do wonder if, I am sure there are cases out there that are unsolved that probably are attributable to him. It is just incredible how long he evaded prosecution, apprehension, and it's just, I'm actually speechless as to say, how could anything be just with a penalty to this man after what he did, especially hearing the victim impacts.
Yeah, and Judge, there is a sense, though, to know that he's never going to be out. Even if there was a thing, compassionate release, and we're going to get to whether or not he's healthy in a second, but the idea that he will never step foot, he will never hurt anybody again, weighing what we talked about, prosecutors weighing, well, we really want to go after the death penalty here, but, if we could get him to admit to even uncharged crimes is what he did, and have the victim speak out, that seems like a win here, right, Judge?
Especially given his age, because the reality is, even if he's on death row, even if that had been his fate, likely he could have been on death row and died while he was still in prison. So yes, I think it is a true win when you have the max sentence that could be sentenced by this judge. He will not get out of jail. And there's got to be, in terms of protecting society and keeping people safe, there's a big win in the fact we know he will not set foot outside of a jail.
So one of the other things that we kept asking was, what is the judge going to say? How does the judge take all of these statements that we heard and somehow compound that into a statement of his own? Here's Judge Michael Bowman.
I generally don't make comments at sentencing, but I am going to make an exception. Having approved of this plea, I will now move on to the imposition of sentence. Mr. D'Angelo, I've listened for the last 3 days from the people you've terrorized and their friends and their family. Their impact statement will always be with me. I was moved by their courage, their grace, their strength, all qualities you clearly lack. I know whatever words I say today will pale in comparison to the words the survivors have spoken. They need to be said. The fundamental principle of law that justice delayed is justice denied is no truer than in this case. But for the dogged persistence and perseverance of law enforcement, their survivors, their families, and citizen detectives, this case may have remained unsolved. There are many heroes like Carol Daly, Paul Holes, Michelle McNamara, and many heroes that I don't even know that brought this day here. And I have little doubt, but for the tenacity and unwavering quest for justice exhibited by Sacramento District Attorney's Office, Emery Schubert, you may have escaped earthly justice altogether. If I listened to the survivors and I've watched you, I could not help but wondering, what are you thinking? Are you capable of comprehending the pain and anguish you have caused? To quote the great American novelist and California native John Steinbeck, to a man born without a conscience, a soul-stricken man must seem ridiculous. To a criminal, honesty is foolish. You must not forget that a monster is merely a variation, and that to a monster, the norm is monstrous. Mr. Steinbeck seems to think that monsters are born and not created. I'm not so sure, but one thing I do know, when a person commits monstrous acts, they need to be locked away where they can never harm another innocent person. It is my sincere hope that with the opportunity to be heard these last few days and the sentence to be imposed, the survivors will find some resolution, will find some peace, and hopefully find some justice, however imperfect.
Judge, that's an incredibly powerful moment. I have to tell you, I don't think that he could have said it better. I understand that was a rare statement. And when a judge delivers a sentence in such a monumental case like this, where there seems to be a pressure on him, how are you going to deliver? What are you going to say? I think he nailed it. What do you think from your perspective?
Absolutely. I think he nailed it. And, you know, it shows you the difference that victim impact statements can make, because it's one thing, Jesse, to hear about the things he pled guilty to and the unknown crimes, but it's a complete another thing to hear from the survivors themselves exactly what they went through and still continue to go through. And I think that's the reason this judge made such a perfect, heartfelt statement in this case.
And just to be clear, there was not much more he could have done. He sentenced him to the max. This was the deal that was reached. It's not as if he could rip it up and sentence him to death. That's not the way the law works. So he did as much as he could do with the powers in his authority. Now, I do want to turn our attention to something else, because after this sentencing, after he was wheeled out of court, the different prosecutors held a press conference. And they showed, we're going to put this up, the video that they wanted to initially get in court. And it's of D'Angelo in his jail cell. We're going to be playing it. And you're going to see him being quite active. Look at how he's behaving. Look at how he's acting. Now, the reason they wanted to get this in was to suggest that he's not this feeble old man who doesn't know what's going on, mumbling to himself. No, this guy's putting on an act. It just shows how much more evil he is. And really, does he even belong in a wheelchair? Does he even need a wheelchair? Mike, I want to, as we're looking at this, what's your perspective? Because clearly the prosecutors couldn't get it in during in court, but they did not wait to show it to the world at large afterwards. What do you make of what we're seeing in this video, in these videos?
Well, I'm surprised they really weren't allowed to show it at court, because in sentencing, the rules of evidence are much more lax. And I just think this is really pathetic. And it goes to the point that you can't believe that he's sorry for what he did, because everything with him is a scam. Everything is some way to mislead people. And I think it would have really, as you said, the judge couldn't have done much more. I think the most effective thing the judge did, other than the 11 consecutive life terms, was he spoke from the heart of this. But this, I think if the judge saw this video, his statement may have been a little bit longer.
Yeah, I mean, this guy is evil incarnate. That's really what he is. And I got to ask you, Mike, I'll stick with you. What does his life look like behind bars? He's the notorious GSK. Is he have a target on his back? Because I know that there were a lot of victim impact statements that said they hope something happens to him.
Well, yeah. There was one there where the person said, "I hope he suffers and is tortured," things of that nature. He is not going to have an easy time in jail. He will probably be in protective custody because of the nature of his offenses, because the jail system has its own set of rules for the punishment for certain offenses, and sexual assault being one of them, and especially sexual assault to children. So he's going to have a tough time. He's going to be probably let out maybe an hour a day. He'll spend 23 hours of the rest of his life in his cell, and maybe out an hour a day so he can exercise.
Hey, listen, he's got a whole jail cell to do push-ups and jumping jacks. Great for him. Good for him. He's got a whole jail cell to do that. All right, when we come back, I want to play a statement from D'Angelo's niece that was read in court. We'll be back right after this.
Mr. D'Angelo, you're now remanded to the custody of the Sheriff of Sacramento to be delivered to the custody of Director of Corrections and Rehabilitation to serve the remainder of your life in state prison. We are adjourned.
Whether you call him the Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist, the Visalia Ransacker, the original Night Stalker, I'm talking about 74-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo. And as you just saw, that was him being led away ultimately to spend the rest of his life in prison for the crimes that he committed against so many people, sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole, in addition to another life term plus 8 years. Now, there was a lot to break down from the sentencing hearing, and actually we heard so many from the victim impact statements, but before the sentencing, D'Angelo, as part of the defense, was able to put in statements of his own. This is one statement from his niece. Take a listen.
This is from a niece. Joseph James D'Angelo is my uncle, not by blood, but by marriage. I've known him my whole life. I was in their wedding when I was 5. I've lived with them on and off throughout the years, spent all summers with them and most weekends. If I couldn't get there by bus, Joe always came and got me. Life with them was good. It was a dream. My life for once felt normal. My home life was troubled. I was verbally and physically abused by my dad. I didn't want to live anymore. It was just torture. Joe stepped in and said she can live with us. That was the beginning of my new life with Joe. He saved my life. I didn't know how good life could be. He taught me everything, always taking me out for driving lessons. He was so patient. Just try again, he'd say. I wasn't used to that. I'm used to getting yelled at and hit for making mistakes. Joe was kind and loving. He played games with me. Joe, out of anyone in my life, has always been my favorite person. I always wished he were my dad. He made my life peaceful. He is a part of why I am good, kind, and loving person I am today. This is my story. This is the truth. I'm thankful I had him in my life. I wouldn't be here today.
Judge, it's incredible to believe that, first of all, he had people speaking on his behalf in some way, but that he was able to be this kind of figure in his niece's life. And I don't think that the statement really had much effect on the judge's decision. Clearly it didn't. It didn't really sway anything any which way. It had no purpose. But the idea that when you listen to this, that he was a totally different person, what do you think?
I think he clearly had two different personalities. This doesn't take away from the criminality of the things he was doing that were so heinous. But I don't believe, Jesse, that he was living this life all of the time. Maybe he treated her that way, or that was her perception of him. But I do not believe that he has been a law-abiding citizen to the T since he committed these crimes in the 70s and the 80s. So clearly this man has two different personalities, and I think he's able to control which one he chooses to be.
Well, it's my understanding that really there was a period of time in the 80s when he stopped, and that period of time coincides when his niece was living with him. So, Mike, we're trying to figure out the mentality of this guy, and I can't help but think, you know, his former fiance had appeared. There was a letter read on behalf of his ex-wife, Sharon Huddle, who testified that his actions have had a devastating and pervasive effect on her life, that she can no longer trust people. So this idea of leading a double life, and let's not forget, he was a police officer whose job was to protect people, and he did the complete opposite. This duality here, I find one of the more fascinating aspects of the Golden State Killer, Mike.
It is. It's perplexing. I'm not so sure I believe the whole letter. It just seems that it almost seems like he was grooming her, the term grooming, because he had so many victims. And it appears he was, he was able to manipulate people. And I just don't know if I actually believe the letter, to be quite frank with you, because it just is so in opposite of what it is, of what he did. And it seems maybe during that period of the 80s, he might have thought that his end was near and his apprehension was near, and maybe he was just trying to build up for in case he ever got caught. But I don't believe the statement, quite frankly.
That's really interesting, because it almost, Judge, would seem to suggest that perhaps someone else knew what he was doing, or someone could have turned him in. I mean, one of the criticisms we heard during the victim impact statements is if police worked a little harder and they coordinated a little bit more with counties, they could have apprehended him sooner. And I know the technology was very different in the 70s and 80s, and we go to 2018 when genetic genealogy was used to ultimately target him. But could he have been stopped earlier, Judge?
Oh, I absolutely think he could have been. I think there were probably a lot of different things that could have been done differently, the communication between the different departments. But also, Jesse, I stand by, people tend to sometimes know in their gut when there's something amiss with a person, or they're a person that's doing awful, terrible things. And I believe in my heart that somewhere along the line, someone knew or suspected or had a gut feeling, or they were afraid to report him, or they were afraid to think that this could really be true about this man. So I do believe there were probably missed opportunities along the way to have caught him sooner.
Well, I will tell you this much. There are a ton of heroes, as the judge said, in this case, whether it's Michelle McNamara, who is the investigative true crime author in this, or the different law enforcement capacities, or just the people who worked with genetic genealogy to ultimately track him down. But it was also a win for the prosecution, the different prosecutors who worked together to move forward with this case. And I want to move now to Todd Spitzer, who's from Orange County prosecutor, who spoke at the beginning of the last day of the sentencing hearing, just talking about what the effect is of this man.
Yesterday marked 40 years to the date that a stranger walked into Patty and Keith Harrington's Dana Point home and robbed those 3-month newlyweds of their life. Yesterday, the day the two brothers testified about their youngest brother, Keith. They never made it to their first wedding anniversary. Manuela Whittam spent 28 short years on this earth, never knowing the joy of motherhood. And you heard yesterday that her surviving husband never lead an appropriate life until he died. Janelle Cruz, 18 years old, life was ended before she realized her dreams of graduating from college or picking out a wedding dress. Natural things we all live for in our lives. For the last 3 days, we heard about the 13 lives that were cut short through murder. We heard of the memories that were never made. We heard of the dozens and dozens of sexual assault victims who had to go through that depraved act while some of their husbands watched, which is beyond comprehension for me. As he was destroying your lives, he got to be on his boat, blow out birthday candles, hold his granddaughter. But all the time in the back of his mind, he knew we would get.
That's a great point that he made there, that you have to wonder, did D'Angelo, even though he was out free, living his life, did he know in the back of his mind that he may get caught when he was 72 years old? I don't know. But, Judge, it's interesting because you look at this and you think, well, what effect did this have on the prosecutors? What effect did this have on law enforcement? This was a win for them. This is closure for them. I mean, this idea of all working together to prosecute him and coming up with this deal, this is something that you don't see very often, correct?
Correct. It's a huge win. And the part that I really don't see very often is when you get a defendant to admit to crimes that haven't been identified. So uncharged crimes. That's amazing, Jesse. And to think the amount of work that went into this and to get them all to a place where, okay, you take the death penalty off the table, but guess what? You've got all this other stuff and he is going to be in jail the rest of his life is a huge win, in my opinion.
And Mike, this is also important that this didn't go to trial. There's always risks going to trial, but for the victims and the victims' family members, if they were called to testify, that would have put a lot of pressure on them. They would have been subjected to cross-examination. So in the end, saving the time and the money and the heartache from trials and multiple trials and how messy that could get, this seemed to be the best possible conclusion in an otherwise horrific story, right?
Yeah. I actually teeter on that a little bit because I assume that the victims had a huge input as to what exactly they're going to do here. I mean, you had so many crimes here, Jesse. You could lose 1 or 2 trials and still have a substantial amount of time you'd be sentenced to. The one thing is, though, it just took so long to resolve this case. I credit the prosecutors currently, but there were some victim statements that really called into question as to how effective the investigations were when these crimes were fresh. There was one boyfriend who spoke about his girlfriend who was raped by him and how horribly they were treated by the police, and certain things could have maybe led. And one thing that really bothered me was the statement they made about, were you in a problem with a police officer, when they seemed they knew who this guy was.
Right. And I mean, this guy was fired after stealing, a hammer and dog repellent, if I remember correctly. That should have been a red flag. But I will say this. They were able to preserve the evidence from one of the original crime scenes, and ultimately that was used later on, genetic genealogy, to track him down. So we can't, be too hard on the original investigation. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to focus a little bit more on this case, but also update in the Chad Daybell, Lori Vallow Daybell case. Stay tuned. And welcome back, everybody. We're still focusing on the sentencing of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. He has been sentenced to multiple terms of life imprisonment, which means he will never step foot out of prison again, and he will never hurt anybody on the outside again. That is a true miracle for people who've been waiting for so long for an answer in this case. Crimes dating back to the 1970s and 80s, murders, rapes, burglaries. Now, I want to turn to Anne Marie Schubert, who's the Sacramento County prosecutor in this case, and she had some strong words about DeAngelo after the sentencing.
So after the last 2 years of court proceedings, many people have asked and wondered, really, who is Joseph DeAngelo? Is he a feeble, old, 74-year-old man? Is he physically impaired? Is he even competent to stand trial or to enter those guilty pleas we saw on June 29th when he rolled in a wheelchair and feigned feebleness? The answer to those questions that so many people have wondered for the last 2 years lies within the definition of a sociopath. A sociopath, in our world, we understand, is a person who has no respect for the rights of other human beings, no respect for the law, no compassion, no empathy, no remorse. He is a person who lacks a conscience or a soul. And under the definition of a sociopath, he is a person who lies, deceives, and manipulates others for no other reason than personal gain.
So, Judge, I'll give you the final word here on this case. You know, obviously, this is the conclusion of one of the biggest true crimes stories we've ever covered, but also it marked one of the first public arrests using this new technology, genetic genealogy. I see this as the tip of the iceberg. It's already being used more and more. You also have defense attorneys questioning it and saying, is it a constitutional violation? The Golden State Killer case, where do we move from here?
Listen, it shows that it works, that is a source of information that can be used to truly catch criminals, which for society's interest is a very good thing. Having said that, I do think that we're going to see litigation coming about the privacy right to privacy, and that those genetic tests voluntarily given for different purposes should not be used to catch criminals. I think we're going to see more litigation, but it proves, this is a case in point, it works as a way to catch criminals who have left DNA behind.
Yep, and you have to wonder if there's a lot of people out there who are getting awfully nervous as technology does more and more wonderful things. All right, we're going to switch gears right now because we want to focus on the arraignment of Chad Daybell. This is the man who's been charged with conspiring to and actually physically tampering with evidence in connection with the discovery of the remains of his wife's children on his property. Now, his wife, of course, is Lori Vallow Daybell, who's been hit with similar charges. And we saw his arraignment on the formal counts that were read against him. And the question is, what did he plead? Take a look.
Judge, at this time, we are prepared to go forward for the entry of a plea. Mr. Daybell, on behalf of Mr. Daybell, we will enter a plea of not guilty to all of the charges and obviously request a pretrial and a jury trial, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Pryor, the not guilty pleas will be entered as to counts 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the information.
Okay, so he pleads not guilty. Now we have a jury trial set for January 2021, expected to last 3 weeks. Mike, let me start with you. You surprised that he pled not guilty? You surprised this is going to move forward to a trial?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, this is a person who gives the impression to me that he has all the answers to all the questions, a very difficult kind of client to represent. And you know, they still haven't been charged with the actual murder here. I would think he'd be weighing in on that to see if he could really cut his losses here and perhaps set up for a double jeopardy should they come across with some evidence in the future. It's a very risky move.
I mean, there's a lot of time between now and a trial. Many things could happen. Judge, gotta ask you, do you think those murder charges are going to hit between now and that trial? Because people keep wondering, why is he and or Lori Vallow not been charged directly in connection with the kids' deaths?
And the only reason I can see that they haven't been charged, Jesse, with the murder of those two children is because either A, the evidence hasn't been located, there's not enough evidence for the state to feel like they can go forward, or in the alternative, the evidence is there, but the investigators are wrapping it up with a nice bow so that when they are charged with murder, they have a good chance and feel like their evidence is all lined up to get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt.
Could be, or it's all Alex Cox, the deceased brother of Lori Vallow. Perhaps the evidence shows that he's the killer and he had a more direct role, and they can't tie the Daybells. I don't know, speculating. Now, I want to turn into something else here because, Mike, apparently Mark Means wants a little bit more time in order to possibly file a motion for a change of venue. Mark Means represents Lori Vallow. Her arraignment has been rescheduled as well. And here's something interesting here. A little earlier on, he had said that the Church of Latter-day Saints, they sent out a letter saying to their leaders, don't initially cooperate in legal proceedings. Idaho has a large Latter-day Saints population. That's going to prejudice a potential jury. He wants to get it moved out somewhere. Maybe they don't know so much about this case. Maybe they're not restricted by this religious order of some kind. This idea to change the venue in his client's case, what do you make of it?
Change of venue to me has become, in this day and age with all the technology, is not as strong of a motion as it used to be, say, 15, 20 years ago. But with all social media, things of that nature, look at Law&Crime Network. We discuss cases across the country. So it's very difficult to really find someone who's not familiar with any high-profile case across the country. And there's that last question every judge asks the juror, regardless of what you heard, can you be fair and impartial? If they say yes, that case will be staying there. And it's just, I don't think it's a very viable motion.
Yeah. Mike, thanks for the shout out for Law&Crime. We're not only in this country, we're international as well. That's a different story. Judge, let me turn to you. Rob Wood, the prosecutor in this case, so he has now said he wants a 14-day notice period. Give me 14 days notice to the defense, Lori Vallow or Chad Daybell, if you plan to bring up anything regarding mental health, perhaps a mental health defense. I found that interesting. What did you make of that?
Well, of course he wants that 14-day notice at a minimum because he needs time to prepare to go against or hire their own experts or whatever the state decides they can do to argue against mental defect. I'm shocked that it hasn't come up yet, and I think the prosecutor's smart to know to expect it because I truly believe that it's going to come up in some capacity by one or both of these defendants, especially if they're charged with murder.
Yeah, and Mike, I want to give you the final word on this as well because we keep having so many updates in this case. Apparently both sides, the state and the defense, Mark Means and Rob Wood, they've asked each other for documents and discovery. So Wood is asking to have anything that the defense may bring up, books, papers, documents, photographs, objects, anything like that. Means has asked for police reports, state witness names, digital media recordings, anything else that they're going to use at trial. Is this standard, or does it tell you something about the case?
Well, if I'm the defense attorney, I tell the state, you're not getting anything now until I get everything from you. Defense doesn't have a burden. And I don't believe they will receive anything from the defense until they receive all the discovery and they can go through and see what their defense is. But they're under no obligation unless there's some sort of glitch in the rules out there in discovery. But it's the state provides discovery first.
Well, I tell you this much. This is what I do know. I know something else is going to happen between now and January. This case is constantly in the news. There's always updates. We will continue to follow it because it's so incredibly strange and it has all these twists and turns. So we will continue to follow it. Now, having said that, when we come back, we're going to focus on something else because there's a big announcement regarding the college admission scandal. Lori Loughlin and her husband, Mossimo Giannulli, have officially been sentenced. We'll be right back right after this. Former White House strategist and advisor to President Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, along with 3 others, have been indicted for allegedly defrauding people who donated money to a fundraising campaign to build the wall on the southern border. Now, authorities say the organizers of this project promised to use the money for that purpose, but they ended up pocketing it for their own personal benefit. Bannon himself is accused of misappropriating the $1 million that he received himself. Now, he has pled not guilty. He's out on a $5 million bond. His passport has been taken away from him. He's restricted on where he can go. So there's a big predicament for him. Now, having said that, the president was asked during a press conference about the legal predicament of his former consultant, and here's what he had to say.
Mr. President, what's your reaction to the indictment of your former campaign aide, Steve Bannon?
Well, I feel very badly. I haven't been dealing with him for a long period of time, as most of the people in this room know. He was involved in our campaign. He worked for Goldman Sachs. He worked for a lot of companies, but he was involved likewise in our campaign and for a small part of the administration very early on. I haven't been dealing with him at all. I know nothing about the project other than I didn't like, when I read about it, I didn't like it. I said, this is for government, this isn't for private people. And it sounded to me like showboating, and I think I let my opinion be very strongly stated at the time. I didn't like it. It was showboating and maybe looking for funds, but you'll have to see what happens. I think it's a very sad thing for Mr. Bannon. I think it's surprising, but this was something, as you know, just by reading social media and by reading whatever it is, and by speaking to Mike and all of them, I didn't like that project. I thought that was a project that was being done for showboating reasons. I don't know that he was in charge. I didn't know any of the other people either. But it's sad. It's very sad.
All right, Judge, I'll start with you. How serious are these charges? And also, how easy is it for a prosecutor to prove?
Well, first of all, follow the money. There's always a money trail. You know, you can do the investigation and figure out where it came from, where it went, or more importantly, in this case, where it didn't go. So in my opinion, proving an embezzlement case is not necessarily that difficult, although it may be tedious to get access to all of the pieces of information that are needed. The second piece of it is, of course, it's serious. You just completely took advantage of the public's trust. When you donate to a fundraiser such as this, you have a belief that that's where the money's going to go. And so it undermines public trust in any organization that raises money, and that makes it a very serious matter.
Yeah, if this goes to trial, it's kind of hard to explain away what you see in documents. Exhibit number A, how do you explain that money? Now, let me ask you this, Mike, because he has a few options here, right? I mean, Bannon now is thinking about what are the next steps. So let's break it down. What are his options moving forward?
Well, he's entitled to the presumption of innocence, number one. Number two is he's got a very strong office in the Southern District of New York. They're very highly respected, used to high-profile cases. He's got three options. Take a plea deal, plead not guilty and go to trial, or join Team USA and have full disclosure to the prosecutors, plead guilty, and give them information that could hurt other people and lead to charges against other people. This is going to be a very high sentence because you have the federal sentencing guidelines, which are advisory to the court, but the courts mainly follow. And he's got an exposure of 20 years. And with this amount of funds, if he was part of a conspiracy, in for a penny, in for a pound. If he only got $100, he's still, under the law, is responsible for the $25 million they're alleging, which would probably put him near the maximum sentence he could get.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how it plays out and what information he has against whom, and is it relevant? Do they care about it? So this will be an ongoing case and an otherwise very strange story. Now, I do want to come to the final story of the program because we have come to the conclusion for two of the most high-profile defendants in the college admissions scandal, Lori Loughlin and Mossimo Giannulli. Now, after entering into a plea deal with prosecutors, the judge officially accepted their guilty pleas to conspiracy and fraud for paying $500,000 to get their daughters into USC. Giannulli was officially sentenced to 5 months in prison, a $250,000 fine, and 250 hours of community service along with supervised release. Loughlin sentenced to 2 months in prison, a $150,000 fine, 100 hours of community service, and supervised release as well. And they are to report to prison on November 19th. Judge, I'll start with you. Are they going to serve the full sentence?
I don't think they necessarily will. I think some people are going to look at this and say they didn't get enough time because of what they've done. But the reality is they're not violent offenders. They're not a threat to society. So there's a reason they're not going to be spending that much time in jail. And in fact, they could get less time than that as they go, depending on compliance, et cetera.
Yeah, and the judge was kind of constricted here. If he were to accept the deal, which is what he did, he really couldn't change the guidelines. That is what was negotiated between the prosecutors and the defense, that amount of time. Now, Mike, here's something interesting. Their parents, the two daughters, they both have to report to prison on November 19th. There's no spacing here. It's not as if one parent can have a little bit more time with the children, watch the children before the next parent goes in. So the fact that they both have to report to the Bureau of Prisons on that date, what does that tell you?
Well, there's always room to make, and I'm sure their lawyers are not done. They will probably make some sort of motions to stagger the turning in and when they surrender to the Bureau of Prisons. But I think they're going to have a rough time with that because it's not really a situation. I know they did that in New Jersey with the Real Housewives of New Jersey with the husband and wife they staggered it, but their children were younger. I mean, these kids got into a good school, I guess, so they have somewhere to go. It's not like they need parental supervision. So it'll be interesting, but I think they're going to turn themselves in when they need to.
No sympathy here for them, but, you know, a parent is a parent, and that's something to think about here. And I have to ask you, you talk about the daughters here. So, Judge, this case was a roller coaster. You had them fighting this. While other people were accepting plea deals and admitting to what they did, Felicity Huffman admitted to what she did. She went to jail for 11 days. You know, they kept fighting it. At one point, they tried to get the charges dismissed. They thought that there was some exonerating evidence. Didn't work out. The judge said, we're going full ahead with this trial. And they ultimately entered into these guilty pleas. Now, I have to wonder how much of this was to protect their daughters. Because based upon what the prosecution released, these daughters knew so much more about what was going on. They were part of the communications. And there have been legal experts who said that these girls should have been or could have been criminally charged. Do you think that that was the rationale here? Do you think that was the discussion between Giannulli, Loughlin, and the prosecutors?
Well, number one, we don't know what their motive was. We never will unless they choose to come out and say what it was. But number two, Jesse, I absolutely believe parents are going to throw themselves on the sword for their children. And so if, in fact, the children knew a lot more and were facing any type of criminal charges, I can promise you these parents probably would absolutely do whatever was necessary to protect their children.
Mike, I'll give you the final word on this. 2 months, 5 months, these were charges that were spanning into 20 years, 40 years. Is this a lenient sentence? Because, and, you know, we talk about celebrities kind of getting off. They're still going to jail. They're still going to prison, and that's not going to be fun any which way you slice it. So did they get off easy, though?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm a little surprised at the U.S. Attorney's Office for giving a deal like this. I think it sends a horrible message. I mean, I'm in the federal courts a lot, and it's very rare that you hear about 60-day sentences, 30-day sentences, especially when you have the federal sentencing guidelines. Federal prosecutors are not usually inclined to give what we call 11C pleas that lock the judge in. Who knows what went on here? Who knows what the deals were on the side? We don't know what happened, you know, behind the scenes. But I do think it's an extremely easy deal, especially since I deal with these sort of issues quite often. And usually you're talking about years, not months, although they're more day for day when it's under a year in federal court in a sentence. So I do think they're going to serve a lot of this sentence.
And look, it makes sense that he got more time because he was more the direct participant here. He actually paid those bribes of $500,000. And let's not forget, I don't want to say threatened, but he definitely had some strong words with the guidance counselor of the high school and said, what are you doing here? What are you doing? You're costing our daughters a chance at USC. So he was directly involved. It would have been interesting if this was a trial, how he would have argued himself out of that, but that's not the case. But it is a conclusion to an incredible story that has lasted in the news for quite some time. Judge, Mike, thank you both for coming on. Everyone out there, thank you for joining us. Until next time, be safe, and we'll see you then.